It is stuffy in the cathedral hall, even though midday has not yet turned into evening. The stone walls breathe dampness. Gray smoke from numerous candles stretches high under the arches, and wax freezes in thick drops on the iron candlesticks. Between the columns are benches for the nobility, crowded with people, the heavy wool of their cloaks rustling, the fur trimmings moving. In the center, against the backdrop of the altar, a solemn procession is forming. The King of France is preparing for marriage, for an alliance that will cement his victories and give him new leverage in Northern Europe. Prayers are heard, Latin formulas glide across the stone, and it seems as if everything is going according to a pre-written script. But the most important thing on this day will happen not at the altar, but immediately afterwards, when the doors of the cathedral close. The marriage, concluded before the entire Christian world, will be rejected almost instantly. And it is this rift, which arose on the very first day, that will turn the life of one queen into a long, cold torture, and France into a field of pressure from Rome. Hello, viewers, and thank you for your attention. Write in the comments where you are watching this story from, and which stories about kings and queens seem to you to be the harshest or most unjust. I wish you a peaceful and attentive listening experience. Let's move on to the story. To understand why the story of Ingeborg of Denmark and Philip II Augustus turned out to be so grim, you need to see what the world around them was like. France at the end of the 12th century was not a confident power with a unified map, but a kingdom that was just beginning to rise after decades of weakness. Philip, known as Augustus, had already proven himself to be a tough and pragmatic ruler. He broke the power of his overly strong vassals, fought the Plantagenets, and built a tighter domain around the crown. But despite all his talent, he remained part of a system where marriage was one of the main tools of politics. His first union with Isabella of Hainault gave him an heir and strengthened his position in the north. When Isabella died, the king was left a widower, and the question of a new marriage became a matter of state rather than a private one. At that time, Denmark was a northern kingdom, whose rulers not only controlled their own lands, but also played a prominent role in the Baltic region. An alliance with the Danish dynasty promised Philip not only symbolic prestige, but also real support against his northern and eastern neighbors, including the imperial structures. The girl chosen for marriage, Ingeborg, was an adult of noble birth, with a dowry and connections that made her a desirable match. From the point of view of cold political arithmetic, everything looked reasonable. The French king strengthened ties with the north, and the Danish house gained an alliance with the growing French crown. The ceremony was conducted according to all the rules. The chronicles record the celebration, the arrival of the Danish entourage, the solemn services, and the exchange of gifts. All this is reminiscent of dozens of other royal weddings, where the personal is dissolved in the political. However, almost immediately after the wedding night, something happens that sources convey with alarming laconicism. The king distances himself from his new wife, and then actions begin that do not fit into the usual picture. Instead of strengthening the union, there are attempts to break it up. Instead of living together, the queen is effectively exiled. From this moment on, Ingeborg's story turns into a series of humiliations, which in themselves violate the norm but remain formally complete. Everything is formalized through commissions of theologians, councils, and letters to the Pope. The myth that arose later likes to explain this turn of events simply. Some retellings whisper about the king's alleged physical disgust, while others invent legends about some terrible secret or inappropriate behavior on the part of his wife. Such versions are convenient. They reduce everything to the psychological breakdown of one person. But documents from the 12th and early 13th centuries tell a different story. Where chroniclers pass on rumors, clerical records show a struggle over wording, lengthy disputes among theologians, interference from Rome, and the threat of an interdict over all of France. There is less passion in this story than it seems, and much more cold calculation and pressure. Philip's first official step was to attempt to annul the marriage. The grounds chosen for this were common for the era: blood relationship to a prohibited degree. The scheme looked familiar. It was necessary to prove that there were family ties between him and Ingeborg that violated canonical norms. To this end, commissions were convened, genealogies were examined, the names of common ancestors were written down, and branches that could be linked into a single line were sought. Outwardly, it looked like theological work. In reality, the adult clergy faced a much more dangerous task: to find a legitimate pretext to satisfy the king's will without destroying trust in marriage as an institution. Against the backdrop of these legal machinations stands the almost immovable figure of Ingeborg herself. Sources paint her as silent, detached, almost voiceless in her own cause. She does not wage wars, engage in court intrigues, or gather a faction around her. Her resistance is expressed not in conspiracy, but in repeated appeals to the Pope, where she insists that the marriage was legally contracted, that there was no blood relationship obstacle, or that it was deliberately ignored when the union was contracted, and therefore any attempt to break it up is an abuse of power. In 12th century terms, this sounded not like an emotional complaint, but like an accusation of distortion of canon law. The French side responds with its own logic. For Philip's entourage, a marriage that the king rejected on the very first night becomes a threat to his honor, and, even more importantly for the era, a threat to stability. A king who is forced to live with a woman he dislikes seems weak to them. Rumors at court take on a life of their own. Whispers about an unacceptable wife, strange features, and alleged incompatibility spread through the palace corridors. Many of these insinuations have no documentary evidence, but they fuel decisions. The adult men at court are ready to provide any evidence to support a line that is favorable to their lord. At this stage, the first important myth arises. In later retellings, Ingeborg is sometimes portrayed as a scandalous or strange wife whose behavior allegedly provokes the king. However, if we rely on documents, we see the opposite. Any real scandal at court would have been used against her openly, in acts, protocols, and letters. Instead, the main theme remains that of kinship and formal violation of the canon. The Queen's personal qualities are hardly described in official documents. For Rome and Paris, she is not a character, but the bearer of a legitimate title that the king is trying to take away. Attempts to resolve the issue within France led to the convening of councils attended by theologians and bishops. These meetings gave rise to a second line of tension. Ecclesiastical authority within the kingdom was partly dependent on the king and therefore inclined to seek arguments in his favor. People appear at court who are ready to swear that the marriage to the Danish princess violates canonical norms. They construct complex kinship schemes and offer interpretations that are sometimes clearly far-fetched. All this is done in order to justify the annulment without outwardly violating the structure of canon law. But outside France, there is another center of power. The Roman Curia is in no hurry to play along with the French crown. The papacy sees Ingeborg's case not only as a family conflict, but also as an important precedent. If the marriage is declared invalid according to the scheme promoted by Philip, it opens the floodgates for dozens of other rulers who want to get rid of inconvenient unions under the guise of suddenly discovered kinship. For Rome, this is a threat to the integrity of the entire system of marriages on which dynasties and political blocs are based. Therefore, the papal decisions fluctuate, but in general, the line remains strict. The marriage was legally concluded. There are insufficient formal grounds for annulment, and the king must recognize Ingeborg as his lawful wife. The further this conflict goes, the colder and more frightening the queen's fate looks. She is effectively deprived of her court, isolated, periodically moved between different residences, living not as a full-fledged ruler, but as a living reminder of a failed union. In the Chronicles, this drags on like a long, almost silent line. In official documents, she may still appear as the king's wife, recognized by Rome, but in reality her participation in government is reduced to zero. Her life turns into a slow existence in a status that exists only on paper. For Philip, this situation is not limited to personal annoyance either. He remarries, openly violating the position of the papacy, and thus turns a private drama into a political challenge. The Pope, in turn, gains a powerful lever. A purely family issue can be used as a pretext to put pressure on the French crown. And this is where a mechanism comes into play that will make Ingeborg's story not only the tragedy of one woman, but also a blow to thousands of people in France. We are talking about an interdict, a church measure whereby a country is deprived of public worship, marriages, and church funerals. Formally, the goal is to force the king to obey canon law. In reality, everyone who lives under his rule suffers. Thus, a marriage that never had a chance to begin becomes a pawn in a larger game. On one side is the king, accustomed to getting his way, and believing that his will is more important than formalities. On the other is the papacy, ready to use spiritual sanctions to force the most powerful ruler in the West to obey. Between them stands the silent figure of the rejected queen, whose name appears in documents as a symbol of legal righteousness, but whose real life flows in the shadows, far from the ceremonial halls. And the further the conflict develops, the more the myth and the document diverge. The myth speaks of a scandalous wife and an unfortunate union. The document shows the use of human destiny as a lever in the struggle for power between the throne and the altar. The interdict over France was the moment when the personal drama of the king and his rejected wife turned into collective punishment. For ordinary people, this meant that the familiar rhythm of life was disrupted in the most sensitive areas. Priests were afraid to openly celebrate Mass. Marriages were conducted in an atmosphere of doubt, and funerals turned into silent farewells without a full ceremony. For people of the 12th and early 13th centuries, this was not just an inconvenience, but a threat to eternal salvation. The fear of dying without a proper funeral became a tool for exerting pressure on people's consciences and daily lives. The papacy, physically distant, suddenly began to be felt in every parish, every village, and every city. For the royal authority, this was a blow that could not be ignored. Philip was accustomed to forcing his subjects to obey by force, bribery, or calculation. Now he was faced with a form of resistance that could not be suppressed by a squad of knights. He could punish disobedient clergy, but he could not restore people's confidence that their marriages and funerals would be recognized by heaven. Each new day of the interdict increased the irritation of the barons and townspeople, who saw that it was not only the king who was suffering from his stubbornness, but they too. The pressure came not only from above, from Rome, but also from below, through whispers, discontent, and indirect threats to loyalty. In this situation, the figure of Ingeborg, seemingly powerless, takes on a paradoxical significance. She does not wage war or give orders, but her name becomes a point of reference for Rome. The Pope can claim that he is defending not an abstract principle, but a specific queen whose rights have been violated. She is a victim of unjust treatment and, at the same time, a symbol that ecclesiastical law stands above any royal whim. In the letters of the Curia, the combination of these motifs reinforces the effect. Both rules and justice have been violated. The French crown finds itself in the position of the accused, for whom the excuses sound increasingly far-fetched. Philip, in turn, continues his resistance. He lives with another woman, tries to formalize a new union, wages his usual wars and negotiations, but the unresolved marital issue hangs over all these actions. In official documents, his new relationship requires legitimization, while Rome stubbornly insists that he already has a lawful spouse. Any attempt to formalize another marriage in canonical form is immediately perceived as a challenge. The internal conflict, which for the king is a matter of personal freedom and dynastic calculation, becomes a test for the papacy. Can it really impose its will on such a powerful monarch? Meanwhile, a quiet war of interpretations continues at the French court. Adult courtiers, wishing to remain in favor, are ready to give testimony that puts the king in a favorable light and his rejected wife in a dubious one. There are indirect hints about her inappropriateness, about some elusive characteristics that supposedly justify the king's dislike. But all these stories circulate only in oral form. In official protocols, the main argument remains the same kinship and formulas about the honor that the king is obliged to preserve. It is precisely this duality, rumors on the inside, dry canonical references on the outside, that makes Ingeborg's story particularly frightening. We see how a living person is turned into expendable material to justify decisions that have long been made at the top. The papacy, unlike Philip's entourage, acted slowly but consistently. Popes changed, but the line remained firm. The marriage was recognized, it could not be annulled, and attempts to ignore the lawful spouse were condemned. The interdict was not used constantly, but the threat of its return hung like a shadow over every escalation. For France, it was a blow to its prestige. The king, who had built an image of himself as a defender of the church within the country, appeared to be a ruler under spiritual punishment. For other European monarchs, it was a reminder that even the most successful king was not omnipotent before the theological apparatus of Rome. The longer the case dragged on, the more obvious it became that there was no easy way out of this struggle. Philip did not want to restore Ingeborg to her full role as wife, fearing that he would lose face and the freedom to maneuver dynastically. The papacy could not yield without threatening to destroy its own authority. Any attempt at compromise ran up against a question of principle. It was possible to bargain over territories, money, and support in other conflicts, but not over the recognition of the legitimacy of a marriage that Rome had already approved once. In theological logic, admitting a mistake in such a case meant admitting that the system itself could be subject to political pressure. Against the backdrop of these macro processes, Ingeborg's own life continued to flow in the shadows. She remained formally the Queen of France, but in practice, she was a woman removed from the court and power. She spent her existence in residence where she lived under supervision, not as a prisoner, but as an inconvenient symbol. For those around her, she was a reminder of a conflict that no one knew how to end. For her, it meant long years of uncertainty, Formally, her status was preserved, but in reality, her rights as a spouse and ruler were blocked. The documents about her maintenance and surroundings contain no pathos, only everyday routine, but it is in this routine that the coldest cruelty of history can be heard. Gradually, however, the situation began to shift. Rome managed to use the marriage issue as a means of exerting constant pressure on France. The king, who needed the support of the papacy in other matters, from the appointment of bishops to the legitimization of political moves against his neighbors, was forced to look for ways to reduce tensions. At some point, political calculation outweighs personal animosity. It is more important to maintain maneuverability in foreign policy than to continue the endless dispute over marriage, which has long since become a byword. This is where we see a quiet shift that rarely makes it into popular retellings. Philip doesn't suddenly have an epiphany or repent in an emotional sense. He just makes a decision based on the logic of power. By recognizing Ingeborg's legal status and allowing her to formally return to her role as spouse, he can diffuse the conflict with Rome without changing the fundamental structure of his own life. He can continue to avoid shared living and intimacy. But according to the documents, the king and queen are once again bound together, as required by canon law. For the papacy, this is a victory for principle. For the king, it is a painful but rational step. When Ingeborg is legally reinstated, history comes full circle. Formally, she is once again queen, her status is confirmed, and her name can appear in documents as the lawful spouse of the French monarch. But the personal side of the union remains dead. This marriage will never become what it was supposed to be according to the plans of both dynasties. It will remain a symbol of the rift between personal will and the structure of canon law, between political pragmatism and the framework into which the Church tried to force rulers. The myth that likes to talk about a scandalous wife or unbearable character seems particularly empty in this finale. The documents paint a different picture. An adult woman, almost deprived of the opportunity to influence the course of events, for many years becomes the central figure in the conflict that defines relations between France and the papacy. Her life was lived in the shadows, but her name was used in papal letters, in acts of interdict, and in negotiations between rulers. Her silence was also part of the political pressure. And when the marriage was finally recognized as indisputable, it brought her no human comfort, but it cemented the main narrative of the story. In the end, this story is disturbing, not because of loud scandals, but because of its cold consistency. The king, wanting to get rid of his inconvenient wife, sets in motion a mechanism that affects the whole country. The papacy, defending canon law, uses the fate of one woman as leverage, stopping at nothing to deprive an entire people of their familiar religious life. The courtiers, seeking to preserve their position, tailor their testimony to the desired version, and the queen herself, endures decades of being rejected, but not legally broken. Myth loves personal drama, but the document leaves us with a bleaker picture. A world in which human life easily becomes hostage to the struggle for power between the altar and the throne, and where restored justice comes not as consolation, but as a dry entry in the Chronicles. The further development of the story resembles the slow tightening of a tight knot, in which each participant almost ceases to be a person and becomes a function. After the legal recognition of the marriage, the issue with Ingeborg does not disappear. It simply recedes into the system. The king continues to live as if he were free from marital obligations, while canon law insists on the opposite. In official formulas, she is the queen. In political practice, she is a shadow. This dichotomy is particularly noticeable in how her name appears and disappears in sources. Sometimes it is included in the list of titles. Sometimes it is omitted from descriptions of court ceremonies. For an era where status determined a person's place in the world, such uncertainty was in itself a form of violence. Meanwhile, the very structure of power born of this conflict continues to weigh on France. The papacy reinforces the idea that it can intervene in the marital affairs of monarchs, not as a private matter, but as an issue directly related to order in Christian society. The interdict, lifted or weakened after concessions, remains in the memory of subjects as a reminder. The king's mistakes can deprive people of their usual religious protection. This undermines the unquestionable image of the ruler and forces them to take into account an external arbiter, Rome, even in areas that were previously considered internal. If we look at this story as a chain of decisions, we can see how the space for personal choice gradually narrows. Philip, who began with an attempt to save his honor and get rid of an unwanted union, finds himself trapped by his own actions. Any new initiative in the marital sphere is perceived through the prism of the unresolved past. Even when he builds a new family line, heirs are born, the dynasty is strengthened. All this is overshadowed by the fact that somewhere on the sidelines there continues to exist a rejected but legally recognized spouse. For Ingeborg herself, this means a long life in a role where her value lies not in her closeness to her husband or her influence at court, but in the fact that she remains a symbol of a principle that Rome did not allow to be eroded. This grim balance clearly shows how myth and document diverge. Legend prefers to tell of a scandalous wife or an unhappy marriage, reducing everything to psychological touches and anecdotes. The archives tell a different story. How the marriage between two adults became a battleground between the king and the pope. How canon law became a tool of pressure, not for the sake of morality, but for the sake of control. About how the fate of one woman can remain hostage to a confrontation for decades, where neither side can afford to admit defeat. And in the final silence of the Chronicles, the most frightening thing is not the cries of scandal, but the dry recording of the facts. The marriage exists on paper. There is no intimacy. The political system has gained another lever, and human life has dissolved into the lines of Latin text. The royal castle lives in a strange regime. Services are reduced, bells ring less often than before, and in some churches around Paris, priests do not dare to serve Mass at all. The interdict over France is not an abstract word from curial papers, but a regime of daily suffocation. People are forbidden to marry. Deceased adult Christians are denied a normal funeral, and baptisms are only allowed as a last resort. The earth continues to turn. The markets are still bustling. But underneath it all, there is a feeling that the country is suspended in midair and cannot touch sacred ground. Adult townspeople begin to whisper that the king's sin affects their bodies more than their own mistakes. For Philip, this becomes a blow to the very foundation of his power. Until this moment, his reign had been perceived as a consistent strengthening of the crown. The confiscation of Plantagenet estates, the consolidation of the domain, administrative reforms. Now the same king is forced to explain why his personal history with one woman, his lawful queen, recognized by marriage, is leading to altars being closed throughout the country. The Pope was using the marital issue as leverage, not on a whim, but as a carefully calculated pressure tactic. Until the lawful wife was removed and the marriage restored, most of France's church life would remain under ban. In response, the royal chancellery launches a campaign that is, in its own way, more frightening than open conflict. At meetings of theologians and lawyers, long chains of kinship are constructed in an attempt to prove that the relationship between Philip and Ingeborg violates canonical norms. Old marriages, common ancestors, intertwined dynasties, everything is brought to light in order to turn a personal refusal into a legal dispute. Rumors about the Queen's unworthiness circulate in the chronicles, and court gossip is recorded. But the documents clearly show how stubbornly they are trying to turn her from a living person into a problem of formula. Meanwhile, Ingeborg herself remains almost invisible to the outside world. And it is this invisibility that underscores the harshness of the situation. She is an adult with a royal title, but her space is reduced to a few rooms, rare church services, and correspondence that goes not through her husband, but through representatives of the church, of the letters that reach Rome reveal not a scandalous figure, but a silent, persistent side. She refuses to acknowledge the annulment, does not sign the waiver, does not make a single formal gesture that could be used against her. As a result, her silence becomes a weapon no less powerful than the papal bulls. The interdict also hit those who tried to support the king. Some of the bishops who sided with him at the beginning of the conflict gradually backed down. For them, closed churches, lay people deprived of the sacraments, and rebellious city crowds were too high a price to pay for satisfying the monarch's will in a personal matter. There is no hysteria in Innocent III's letters, but there is a consistent line. Until the lawful wife is restored to her rights, France will live under punishment. The fact that the king declares it his right to correct the marriage for the sake of honor becomes a convenient point for the papacy to show who in Europe has the final say in matters of matrimony. The situation is also unbearable for the secular elites. Adult barons are losing income due to the disruption of church life. The flow of pilgrims is decreasing. Fairs associated with religious holidays are being canceled, and transactions requiring church certification are becoming difficult. City councils are forced to maneuver between royal power and fear of spiritual sanctions. And in all these strata, there is a gradual realization that the monarch's stubbornness makes everyone vulnerable. This is not a romantic story about an unhappy marriage, but a chain of material consequences. Under the pressure of this silent rebellion, Philip is forced to make concessions that he had recently considered impossible. At first, there are attempts at partial solutions. There is talk not of a complete restoration of the marriage, but of recognizing certain rights of Ingeborg, her status at court, and the symbolic return of her title. The king hopes to maintain a de facto separate existence, retaining freedom in his personal life. But Innocent III insists on the principle. Either the marriage is recognized as valid, or the king remains under attack. The papacy does not back down, because it understands that if it gives in now, any ruler will be able to refer to honor and character to rearrange marriages to suit his taste. The most disturbing thing about this story is that none of the participants sees themselves as monsters. Philip is convinced that he is defending the dignity and interests of the crown by getting rid of a union he considers a mistake. The Pope believes that he is defending the sanctity of marriage and at the same time strengthening the authority of the Church. Ingeborg, deprived of a normal married life, clings to the only means available to her, her legal status as a wife. But it is precisely this cross-cutting righteousness that makes the situation irresolvable. Every step that seems logical from the point of view of one institution turns into a layer of fear and pain for the whole country. In the official documents drawn up at the height of the conflict, there is almost no trace of personal emotion. There are lines about commissions of theologians, about the convening of councils, about the confirmation or rejection of arguments about kinship. There are mentions of fines imposed on disobedient prelates, negotiations with papal envoys, and attempts to postpone or mitigate the effect of the interdict. And yet each such sheet of paper is another layer of pressure on a person who continues to be listed as queen, but lives as a prisoner. The myth likes to tell of a scandalous wife, but the document shows a silent, legally recognized spouse whose existence becomes the center of geopolitical blackmail. The city records of the late 12th century become more alarming. Complaints about deals that fell through due to the absence of priests are increasingly being recorded there. Rich townspeople increasingly seek workarounds to bury their deceased relatives with at least some kind of prayer. Merchants increasingly postpone trips because fairs, which depend on the church calendar, are banned. The interdict that Rome imposed on France is becoming an instrument of pressure not in theory, but in everyday practice. It affects every adult resident, and thus the king's personal problem becomes the problem of millions. The familiar fabric of life is being torn apart, and this poses a threat to stability far more serious than any military campaign. Under the pressure of these circumstances, the royal chancellery begins to look for workarounds. Delegations are sent to the Curia in Paris to try to soften the conditions. They say that the king is ready to return the title to Ingeborg, but is not ready to live with her as a spouse. They offer terms under which she would receive support and a position at court, but the actual separation would remain in place. The Pope refuses, knowing that any compromise would set a precedent that would destroy the concept of marriage as an indissoluble union. He uses legal language about the validity of the union, about marital fidelity, about canonical norms, but in each letter, it is clear that there is a strategy behind this: to force the powerful French king to recognize the limits of his power. Meanwhile, pressure is mounting on those who supported the king. Some prelates, who previously defended Philip's position, now see that resistance to Rome threatens to destroy the normal life of their parishes. In some regions, priests secretly perform services at night so that adult parishioners do not die without absolution. In others, lay people are beginning to show open defiance, demanding that bishops speak out against the king. It is in this atmosphere that a faint but growing movement can be heard for the first time. Some of the clergy see Ingeborg not just as a woman, but as a symbol of the order that the king has violated. Against this backdrop, the Queen's silent position becomes a source of strength. She gives no convenient pretext for accusations, does not violate canonical requirements, and does not challenge either the Church or France in the literal sense. She simply does not recognize the annulment. Each of her signatures on letters to the Pope, each formula in which she calls herself the lawful wife, turns her into the center around which political and spiritual arguments revolve. An adult woman, deprived of access to the court, becomes the mainstay of Rome's position because her silence fits perfectly into the canons. She does not break her vow, does not leave, does not give in, does not give the king a single legal hook. The courtiers loyal to Philip respond with what they know how to do. They create an atmosphere of testimony, hints, and retellings that are supposed to prove that a relationship with Ingeborg is impossible for reasons related to temperament, illness, or incompatibility. These texts look like an attempt to compensate for the lack of real grounds. They sound strange in the documents. There are no facts in them, only statements that can serve as propaganda at court, but not as a legal basis for annulment. The clergy close to the Pope easily recognize this as a political game. Such arguments cannot annul a marriage that was publicly solemnized before the clergy and confirmed by all canonical formulas. At this time, the king takes another step, quieter but far more dangerous. He enters into a union with a woman named Agnes de Moran. recognizing her as his de facto wife until the issue of Ingeborg is resolved. For Rome, this is a direct challenge. The Pope declares that as long as the first wife is alive, and the marriage has not been legally annulled, any relationship the king has with another woman is a violation of canon law, which increases the punishment. And it is this aspect that makes the situation even bleaker. The children born to Agnes are at risk of being declared illegitimate. Unlike the usual anecdotes about royal romances, the document presents this line much more harshly. It is about the status of heirs, the future of the dynasty, and the legal purity of power. The burden falls on both the barons and the city elders. They need to keep the peace among the people, who are finding it increasingly difficult to cope with the absence of religious rites. Their letters to the royal chancellery are becoming more alarming. They warn that further resistance to Rome could lead to open rebellion. For Philip, one thing is important: not to lose face before the Church, and not to show that the Pope can dictate terms to him. His reign was built on strength, and now one personal issue threatens to destroy that image. However, it is precisely this personal line that shows the real scale of the conflict. The king is trying to maintain control over his body and destiny, while the Pope demands recognition that marriage is not the property of the monarch, but an institution controlled by the Church. And this struggle goes beyond moralizing chronicles. The documents reveal tension throughout Europe. Other rulers view the French crisis as a precedent. If Philip yields, papal power will increase. If the Pope yields, kings will gain a tool to change marriages for political gain. Meanwhile, the pressure on the king becomes too strong, and the first signs of his concessions appear. He partially restores Ingeborg's rights as queen, although he continues to keep her isolated. She receives recognition of her title, receives security, receives status, but she does not receive her husband and does not return to the marital bedroom. This half-hearted solution does not satisfy Rome, but it is a step toward what will later lead to the complete restoration of the marriage. This whole story is moving further and further away from myth and closer to fact. Legends speak of a scandalous wife who was allegedly the cause of France's suffering. But sources show the opposite. Ingeborg's silence and steadfastness, her refusal to give in, her clinging to legal truth, make her a key figure in the political struggle between the crown and the papacy. She is a grown woman who has almost nothing left but her status. And it is this status that becomes the lever that breaks the resistance of the most powerful monarch in Europe. And the further the conflict develops, the clearer it becomes that the real battle is not for honor or feelings. It goes beyond power. The king is trying to prove that he can control his own destiny. The Pope proves that the king's fate is also subject to canon law. And Ingeborg is the only immovable center of this vortex around which the political storm of all France revolves. The archives of the early 13th century become dull and heavy, as if the paper itself is tired of recording the king's endless attempts to escape the alliance he once made for the sake of diplomacy. The interdict is lifted, but the shadow of its consequences can be felt in the complaints of cities, in the financial reports of bishoprics, in the anxious correspondence between monasteries and the court. The priests have returned to the churches, but the fear of a repeat ban remains. Church structures have realized how fragile the king's power can be if the papacy decides to use the marital issue as leverage. These documents reveal that the world has not yet recovered from the blow dealt by the marriage dispute. Meanwhile, something that is rarely mentioned in the chronicles, but is evident in the Chancery scrolls, is becoming apparent. Adult men and women, accustomed to living by clear rules, are finding it increasingly difficult to tolerate a situation where the king effectively recognizes the marriage but continues to ignore it. Ingeborg has a title, a secure residence, and recognition as queen, but she has no access to power, no participation in politics, not even the banal right to attend important court events. Her life turns into a series of confirmed acts, payments for her maintenance, gifts to monasteries in her name, confirmation of her status, without any real role. This layer of documents, without emotion, without detail, in itself reveals the cruelty of a situation where the queen exists as a living canon, but not as a person. Meanwhile, fear grows within the court. The king realizes that his future generation, born of Agnes, stands on fragile ground. If the papacy decides to review the status of these children, their legitimacy will collapse. The letters from the royal chancellery sound insistent, almost desperate. It is necessary to achieve recognition of these children. It is necessary to strengthen the alliance with the Church. It is necessary to show obedience without showing weakness. It is a difficult balance to maintain, and every document that mentions Philip's children is filled with anxiety that canon law could turn against them. When Agnes dies, the situation becomes even bleaker. On the one hand, the reason why the king insisted on annulment disappears. There is no longer the union he wanted to legitimize. On the other hand, Agnes's disappearance leaves him alone with an unresolved marriage that canon law considers valid, but he finds unbearable. In this silence after death, which the chronicles describe mildly, but which the documents convey through changes in political correspondence, Philip finds himself, for the first time, in a position where it is no longer advantageous for him to fight the Church. He needs peace, and most of all, he needs recognition of his heir. At this time, Ingeborg does the same as before. She maintains her status, does not deviate from canon law, and does not give the slightest reason for a new annulment procedure. Her age, her health, her position, everything is recorded in scrolls, and in this dryness, one senses iron resolve. She survived the humiliation of the wedding and immediate separation, survived the interdict, survived the slander of the courtiers, survived attempts to replace her with another woman. And now, as the political winds change, she remains the only figure who cannot be bypassed or erased. The king, having lost Agnes, begins a gradual drift toward legal recognition of the marriage. In documents, this is expressed mildly. The queen receives additional funds, access to the best residences, formal privileges. At first, it looks like an attempt to ease tensions with the papacy. But the further it goes, the more obvious it becomes. Philip is preparing for a formal reconciliation. He does not seek a marital life, and sources show no steps in this direction. But he is forced to return Ingeborg to the court structure, at least in a legal sense, in order to strengthen his son's position in the eyes of the church. And then a turn of events occurs that is rarely mentioned in popular accounts. At the beginning of the 13th century, after many years of isolation, Ingeborg becomes the legally recognized Queen of France. Not a former queen, not a companion, not a hindrance, but the king's lawful spouse. This restoration is not a gesture of love or an attempt to correct the past. It was a cold political calculation based on the need to ensure the stability of the succession. The restoration is recorded in the documents in a restrained manner, but this restraint reveals the depth of the conflict. After more than a decade of struggle, the king agreed to what he had been running away from since the first day of his marriage. At the same time, the relationship between the spouses remains empty. There is no hint of their rapprochement in the documents, no records of joint trips, no evidence of attempts to restore marital relations. They exist in the same system of power, but in different worlds. Ingeborg receives all the rights of a queen, but does not receive a husband. Philip restores the marriage, but does not restore intimacy. The canon declared the union indissoluble, but human life within that union had long since died. And yet it is precisely this legal gesture that becomes the finale of the story. The king achieves his goal. The heir is recognized as legitimate. The church receives confirmation of the indissolubility of the marriage, and political tensions ease. Ingeborg, without struggle, without intrigue, without allies, wins simply because she did not violate canon law. Her steadfastness ultimately proves stronger than the king's will, stronger than the pressure of the court, stronger than all attempts to rewrite the law to suit the monarch's personal desires. A popular myth explains this story through the image of a scandalous wife, but the document shows a different reality. The real conflict is hidden in the clash between power, canon, and diplomacy. The king, confident in his right, found himself bound by the law that he himself had recognized. The church proved that it could set limits even on the most powerful monarch in Europe, and the queen, an adult who remained in the shadows, became a symbol not of romantic drama, but of the severity of the legal world, where sometimes silence speaks louder than any political statement. Thus ends a story that began as the king's personal attempt to get rid of his undesirable spouse and turned into a sign that even a monarch cannot use marriage as a tool. And it is in this cold, dry, almost emotionless victory of the canon that we hear what makes such cases truly grim. People's fates here become an appendage to the structure of power, and decisions made in the name of honor and politics turn private life into a knot that cannot be untied for decades. Ingeborg's legal victory is not a love story. It is a story of how one formal union and an attempt to destroy it became a battlefield between the crown and the church. The documents, which outlived all the participants, record only the facts: the date of the wedding, the day of separation, the years of interdict, and the final recognition of the marriage. But between these lines, one senses the silence of a woman who, without an army, influence, or allies, became a figure before whom Philip II, Augustus, was forced to bow, not with his heart, but with the law.